everybody. Apologies, we're running a couple of minutes late. We were having a couple of the regular technical issues that has become, something of our daily lives these days. But very welcome to this panel on the aftermath of COVID-19. How can regional integration help? This is part of the inaugural Geneva Trade Week, but it's also TULIP's inaugural panel. And TULIP is a Geneva-based consulting firm that I'm heading that basically focuses on helping developing countries to make trade work better for sustainable development. So we're really excited to be participating in the Geneva Trade Week and to hopefully add and reflect on some of the key issues that we're experiencing today in this unprecedented time of COVID-19. I'm really excited to introduce to you an excellent lineup. We have with us today His Excellency Ambassador Chet Blackman, and the ambassador is a permanent representative of Barbados to the United Nations and other international organizations here in Geneva, and has worked in international development, in the international development sector for over 15 years, including as an international trade specialist, but also as a development consultant. And as the Geneva community knows, he currently chairs the Committee on Trade and Environment here in Geneva. So we're really glad to have the ambassador with us. Then we've got with us Trudy Hartzenberg, who is the Executive Director of the Trade Law Center, also known as TRALAC in South Africa. And she works on Africa's trade and integration agenda, competition policy, investment, and industrial policy. And for those of you who know her, if you have any questions about Africa and trade or the African Continental Free Trade Area, you know that you've got to be knocking on Trudy's door because she will have all the answers for you. And she also serves on the WTO Chair's Advisory Committee and is a member of the Committee for Development Policy of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. Then we've got with us Patrick Lowe. He is currently a fellow at the Asian Global Institute and has served as chief economist at the WTO for 16 years and has also held a variety of other positions. He has taught policy courses on trade and climate change, including at the Hong Kong University, and has extensive and very deep knowledge on trade and basically everything that you can fill in afterwards. He's also occupied various other consultancy positions. And last but not least, I'm very happy that he is an advisory board member of TULIP as well. So we're very happy to have Patrick with us here today as well. Before we get into our list of speakers, I'd like to just give a little bit of an overview about the topic. So today, we're speaking about regional integration and the role of regional integration in the aftermath of COVID-19. As you all know from reading the headlines in the news, COVID-19 has significantly reduced trade volumes between countries. The WTO found that global merchandise trade fell by 15% in the second quarter in terms of volume. And that's, amidst the global lockdown. So every country is experiencing the impact of reduced trade flows and shifting trade flows. A couple more statistics. So from the Global Trade Alert, as we all heard in the aftermath, to respond to the pandemic needs, countries were imposing export restrictions to ensure that they kept in their country essential medicines and food and other products. And those export restrictions came in the form of export controls or bans or discretionary licensing. And the Global Trade Alert found that 91 jurisdictions reported a total of 202 export controls on medical supplies. And those were 30, and in addition, there were 33 jurisdictions executing a total of 54 export controls since the beginning of 2020. And on the flip side, a lot of countries were taking import measures. So they wanted to erect barriers, keep products from leaving the country, and reduce barriers to get the essential products into the country. So you've seen, the Global Trade Alert measured that 106 jurisdictions are reported to have executed a total of 229 import policy reforms, mostly in the form of tariff liberalization, and that's on medicine. And an additional 73 jurisdictions have reported a total of 102 import policy reforms since 2002 on food and agriculture. You don't have to remember these statistics. You probably already forgot. But the reason I'm mentioning that is just to indicate that we're really at a point where trade has become an instrument that countries have been using to respond both to the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, but also more generally. And so what has been the role here for regional communities in coming together and being more effective as they struggle to grapple with the aftermath of the pandemic? Across the world, different regional economic communities and trade agreements and trade unions have, customs unions have responded to COVID-19 in different ways. As you can imagine, if you have a continent or a regional community and country A is imposing a ban on the export of, or is imposing an import ban on secondhand clothing, and country B on cigarettes, then it's going to be very difficult to keep trading with other countries. So a coordinated response has been something that's been quite essential in the aftermath of this pandemic. So this panel focuses on what have regions done to better respond to COVID-19, and what else can they do? And not only that, how can different regions learn from each other? And more specifically, with this panel, we're focusing on developing countries. Because developing country needs are in this pandemic, they're quite different than, the need is more urgent, right? Because a lot of developing countries are dependent on importing essential medicine and food from developed countries. So there is a lot more vulnerability that needs to be addressed. So in this panel specifically, we're going to hear from Ambassador Blackman about what CARICOM has done in this regard. And we're going to hear from Trudy about what's being done in the African continent, both within the regional and economic communities, and potentially what their role could be, the African Continental Free Trade Area. And then Pat Lowe will take us to the next section of the panel, where we're going to think a little bit more about what the role can be of the WTO in scaling up some of these best practices that are emerging, and in facilitating a global response to this pandemic that is inclusive of the needs of developing countries as well. And thereby we're going to look at both the immediate response related to access to essential products, but also the longer term response in reducing vulnerabilities of supply chains and what roles regional communities can play. So with that introduction, I'm giving the floor to Ambassador Chad Blackman, and we would like to hear from him what the CARICOM has done in the last couple of months to mitigate the effect of the pandemic, and any best practices that have emerged from there that he likes to share.
Well, thank you very much, Colette, for the invitation and also giving me the floor. I'd like to say, and to set some context, my presentation, is that the region, the CARICOM region, by and large, is driven by tourism and services. Region tourism, we've virtually seen that no foreign reserves were coming into many of our countries through that aspect, Barbados being one of them. And therefore, the economic impact was very, very heavy on the economy. There are not many sectors as well who are reliant on that sector. Now, that is one aspect. With regards to the health, many of our countries, even before COVID-19 took place, had already been experiencing a number of challenges relative to their health sectors. So therefore, the pressure and demands on the health service coming in the advent of COVID-19 plays a significant impact on the economies throughout the region. Now, when you combine these two things together, happening all at once, you then get to appreciate that it was and still remains a very difficult time for countries in the CARICOM region, like many other countries in the world. But I have to go further. As I've said each time over and over, in every crisis, there's a level of opportunity. And it has really forced our countries in the region to use their intellect, creativity, and the limited resources and policy space that we have to come up with solutions that allows for us to mitigate the circumstance and to move forward. But I also want to mention the fact that in as much as COVID-19 has caused a negative impact We also still have other issues that affect the region and our vulnerability, issues relative to, for example, climate change and the environment. As you know, we are still currently in the hurricane season, and a number of countries throughout the last 3-4 years have been impacted by Category 4 or Category 5 hurricanes. Some of these countries are still recovering economically. So therefore, the pressure on member states at this time has been tough. What are some of the opportunities that have presented themselves? Deeper cooperation amongst member states. Member states, through the CARICOM family and organization, have really used a lot of technical support and sharing of best practices in order to help mitigate the circumstance. Domestically, for example, from Barbados, as I said, tourism is our #1 sector, but we've now used the opportunity to roll out a 1-year visa program, which allows for persons to work from Barbados whilst being able to deliver on their job. Now, that therefore brings in foreign exchange. It allows for persons to be able to go and come within a 1-year period and not have to be limited by a 2-week or 3-week exercise of travel. And it also is a lot easier because COVID has shown, and like we're doing now, we're able to meet virtually and still get things done. All you need is a good bandwidth connection, which Barbados has excellent IT infrastructure, and you have your laptop or your device and you plug away. So the point is that in everything there's an opportunity, but the challenges are very, very real. Issues related to food security, I must mention, there has been a very strong set of resilience from countries in the region. For example, countries like Guyana, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Belize, who are by and large agriculturally led. They have been able to provide a lot of buffer for other CARICOM jurisdictions. Because you mentioned in your introduction, and quite rightly so, the whole issue of export restrictions. A number of our economies, actually most of our economies, are dependent on securing food from North America and further afield. So when the suppliers of these goods in other jurisdictions are limiting even for their own populations, can you then imagine the impact that it has had on receiving countries who also rely on these goods and services? So domestically, through the CARICOM single market and economy, it has allowed, therefore, even greater movement of goods throughout the region. And it's unfortunate that sometimes a crisis like this forces us as countries to deepen our cooperation even more. But you get to restock and you get to relook. So that mechanism has worked. But you also touched on another aspect of export restrictions, which we've also been impacted on. The whole issue of ventilators. We don't create them. We have to import them. But there have been instances where other states who manufacture have actually blocked orders and gifts donated to countries in the region in circumstances where our persons and citizens need it the most. However, I must say that the opportunity, therefore, presents itself as a region because our populations are by and large very small. So the issue of critical mass becomes another factor that we have to consider. How do we respond to creating the goods and services that we need in modes of external shock? Because let us be very clear, external shocks will come. The question is, how will you prepare yourself for them, and in what way? What capacity constraints are there that we need to overcome? So therefore, as a region, instead of just operating as Barbados or Trinidad and Tobago or St. Kitts and Nevis, when you combine your market and you produce on a regional scale, you have economies of scale. Now, for example, ventilators. This pandemic has shown that we need them, okay, and other regions need them. You now have to offer incentives for your private sector and your research community, universities, etc., to create the types of things that are driven by demand. So it allows for intra-regional trade backed by relevant intellectual property protection. So these are some of the things. So as a region, we have been able to carve out a very strong response. The region is doing quite well in relative terms to ensure that the populations are taken care of relative to health. There's now amongst some members of CARICOM a CARICOM travel bubble, which therefore, if you are classified as a low-risk jurisdiction, the citizens of that country are allowed to travel regionally within that bubble. And the principle behind that is that, as I said at the beginning, tourism plays a significant part for most of the member states of CARICOM. So therefore, that serves as an economic driver to stimulate trade, the purchases of goods, the hotel sector, etc. So these are some of the strategies that we have developed in the aftermath of COVID, and we're still doing them because COVID is still taking place. And I also want to say that we have to think strategically and creatively in looking at the regional mechanisms and not just thinking domestically, because we have more bang for your buck if we do this as a region. Even the purchase of medicines will become a lot cheaper if we consider purchasing them as a region and then you distribute them domestically, as opposed to each jurisdiction buying their own. So these are some of the things that I think in light of COVID, that there are opportunities for growth.
Many thanks, Ambassador Blackman, for that really interesting overview. It looks indeed that the CARICOM has played an essential role in creating a successful response in the Caribbean countries to the pandemic, and has been highlighted in various press articles for what it's done as a region. So it looks like there may be some specific measures that can be learned from the CARICOM experience and that other regional entities perhaps could likewise consider, but we can get into that in a little bit. I would like to now give the floor to Trudy to give us an overview of how this has been for the African continent and for different regional communities within Africa.
Thank you so much, Colette, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be with you to talk about COVID and the responses both at national and regional level on the African continent. If there is one thing that we've learned, is that we are truly interconnected on the continent and of course globally too. And that means that national responses will be inadequate. Regional and multilateral responses are particularly important to deal with not only the pandemic, but also the economic effects of the particular measures that have been adopted to curb the spread of the virus. I think extremely important to keep in mind from Africa's regional integration agenda is that we have a large number of regional economic communities, and most African countries actually belong to more than one. This has very important implications as regards implementation and also governance. So we have to monitor that quite carefully. Very important to keep in mind that very soon after the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, we saw on the African continent as elsewhere national responses to curb the spread of the virus. And this included border closures, for example, as well as restrictions, particularly on export of essential products. And essential products were defined rather differently across the countries in the various regional economic communities in Africa. They included medical supplies, personal protective equipment, but also certain food products. And that, of course, had regional impact. So the important lesson for us at this stage was that national responses in terms of the national constitution and domestic laws of a particular country also had significant regional impacts. And of course, this was particularly so when measures were adopted by the regional hegemons. South Africa, for example, closed 35 of its land borders. This was really to stem the movement of people across borders. Cargo still continued to cross the borders, but stopping the cross-border movement of people immediately cut off livelihoods of an enormous number of households in the border communities and elsewhere. So the measures have had significant regional impact, not only on the immediate neighbors, but of course, along our transport and trade corridors. So extremely important to keep that in mind. Ambassador Blackman has mentioned the impact and the fragility of our healthcare systems in developing countries. And this certainly was also evident across the continent, where we struggled to get tests test results out in due time. This had an impact on trade as truck drivers were quarantined for up to 2 weeks in certain countries, and that had enormous impact in terms of intra-Africa trade. So very important to keep that in mind. When it comes to regional responses, our regional economic communities are member state driven. We do not have supranationality. And very important to keep in mind that when we take a look at our trade protocols and other legal instruments governing intra-regional trade, they do include provisions for general exceptions, the counterpart of Article 20 in the GATT, which means, in fact, that member states quite legitimately took a number of restrictive trade measures, which then, as I've mentioned, had a very important regional and in some cases continental impact. But we did see from about April some responses from the regional economic communities, the Economic Community for West Africa, East African Community, Southern African Development Community, and many, many others, as they started issuing guidelines and recommendations to facilitate cross-border trade, to curb the spread of the virus, but also to cooperate in terms of the adoption of digital trade solutions, issue of e-certificates of origin, standard certificates, acceptance of e-payments, and so on. But very important to keep in mind that these are guidelines. They cannot be enforced. And therefore, we still came back, unfortunately, to the fact that some countries within regional economic communities did not necessarily follow those guidelines. Again, as I've mentioned, the lists of essential products, although regional recommendations were made at some regional economic community levels, these, of course, were not implemented consistently across the membership of those particular RECs. So that's quite important to keep in mind. However, we also saw very important initiatives by the regional business councils, where they issued guidelines to their members. And I think this was a particularly important complementary initiative to that by the regional economic communities, the secretariats, and other regional institutions. What we have seen is that at the continental level, the African Union level, there have also been a number of important initiatives, and Colette referred to the AFCFTA. Before I say something about the AFCFTA, at the African Union level, a continental task force was established very early on in the pandemic. And in terms of this broad initiative, the AU initiative, support and a lot of advice and information sharing was undertaken at the continental level, focused initially particularly on the healthcare sector, sharing information about incidence, mortality, treatment, availability of drugs, and so on, PPE and more. And that was particularly important. More recently, in June, President Cyril Ramaphosa launched an African medical supplies platform. He's currently chair of the African Union, and in that capacity, this important e-commerce initiative was launched. It's a platform on which medical supplies, technical equipment, medical equipment, and pharmaceutical products are made available. And both African and global vetted suppliers are able to provide their products on the platform. It's a collaborative initiative also with the African Bank, Africa's Export-Import Bank. They facilitate payments on the platform. And it's also supported by logistics operators and transport companies across the continent to do delivery. So a multi-party initiative, particularly important to ensure access to medical equipment and other supplies as they may be needed. A more recent initiative, which I think is particularly interesting to monitor, is among the so-called tripartite countries. Those are the member states in the Southern and Eastern African regions belonging to the Southern African Development Community, the East African Community, and the Common Market for East and Southern Africa. These three regional economic communities have been working together for some time on practical trade facilitation matters. And so they've launched some years ago already a tripartite trade facilitation program. And it is a counterpart to what will eventually be a free trade area that these countries are still busy negotiating. Negotiations started some 6-7 years ago, but are still ongoing. But under this trade facilitation initiative, these member states have launched a corridor trip monitoring system. This is an e-platform to monitor cross-border road transport in particular, to take a look at testing of truck drivers, make test results available confidentially via the platform, but also to provide information about transport routes, any road blockages or whatever might be impediments to the cross-border road transport industry. I think this is an extremely important development, certainly a counterpart to many of the trade facilitation initiatives under the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement, where, of course, if we take a look at the commitments that African countries have undertaken, which relate to facilitating cross-border movement of goods, expediting pre-shipment clearance and post-clearance checks and so on, more effective risk management, the use of digital trade solutions. This is a very important complementary initiative. So we look forward to see how that will contribute. There are 3 pilot transport corridors which are being implemented very soon. The one is from the Atlantic coast of Namibia Walfish Bay corridor, the Trans-Kalahari corridor, and certain stretches of the North-South corridor. So these are some of the important initiatives. And I do want to emphasize that if we take a look at the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations, and Colette, this is quite an important opportunity that we have. COVID-19 has disrupted the negotiations process, but it's not completely derailed. And so we were supposed to start trading on the 1st of July. We did not make that deadline. And we now hope to start trading on the 1st of January next year. But there is a window of opportunity where we can apply some of the learning from the COVID-19 experience, because we're still negotiating tariff concessions, some rules of origin, and specific commitments for the 5 priority services sectors. Those priority services sectors do not include healthcare, for example. There is an opportunity perhaps to take a look at broadening that agenda. But on the trade and goods front, when we focus on tariff concessions, this is an opportunity for African countries to consider very seriously a bold initiative to reduce, to eliminate expeditiously tariffs on essential goods. So this could be a very important contribution under the AFCFTA. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Trudy, for this really comprehensive overview of the initiatives that have emerged from the African continent, both at a regional economic level and also the ones that have emerged from the business community and from other angles as well. This is really, it sounds like there's a lot happening. I wanted, before we go to Patrick and turn to the WTO side of things, I wanted to quickly ask or touch upon something you mentioned about a lot of the regional economic communities having set out guidelines that are guidelines. They're not binding, as you said, right? And it remains up to countries to ultimately implement that, as regional economic communities are driven by the member states. And I was wondering, and turning this back to Ambassador Blackman, what the experience has been with respect to the implementation of regional COVID-19 related guidelines at the national level, and whether governments have followed those recommendations and guidelines, or whether there likewise has been some challenges. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that, and then we'll turn the panel to Patrick and delve into the WTO.
Thank you very much. You're right. Regional countries have, by and large, had different levels of implementation. And you must appreciate the fact, as you suggested, they are sovereign states. Where the guidelines are just that to give you a benchmark to follow. But I must say that on a regional level, and in the context of CARICOM, each jurisdiction operates at a different level of capacity. So one jurisdiction may be able to treat X, whereas another may be able to do so perhaps in a longer period of time. But I think the guidelines have worked in the sense that you now have a benchmark in which allows for your policymakers to follow. What has to happen, I think, in the short to medium term is that those guidelines must also have an aspect of clear timelines and reflection. Because many times you set guidelines and the situation, as you can see in COVID, is very fluid. So there's no certainty sometimes in response to how can countries actually implement what they're seeking. But I think we have to go a bit further within the context of regionalism to treat these things. But it's not going to be easy because there's no, for example, in our region, there's no supranational body that can actually enforce these things. So it's still left up to member states to actually implement any guidelines that would be agreed upon. But one thing I also want to flag, for example, which across the region continues to be an issue, is more from the aspect of the environment. The use, for example, of masks are in demand. They're needed. It's a response to COVID-19. But the impact that it has had regionally continues to be of great concern. And I think that's one direction that we all ought to go in ensuring that at a regional level, notwithstanding our challenge and need for protective equipment, that we still ensure that our commitments to the environment, in the advent of climate change, in the advent of ensuring that our marine life is protected. These are some of the tangibles that I think, without having a lot of resources at your disposal, that you can actually implement whilst still trying to grapple with everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Ambassador Blackman. I think that's a really important reminder that we don't approach different issues through different lenses in silos, but that we keep focusing on holistically on everything that gets a country to develop sustainably, including the environment, as well as responding to external shocks like COVID-19. So I think that's a really important reminder as we're thinking about what else regional communities can do. But from what I'm hearing, it sounds like there are opportunities here about the role of regional communities, also as Trudy mentioned, in the ongoing negotiations at the African continental level with respect to market access, with respect to tailoring some of the commitments that are being negotiated to some of the needs and creating a more robust internal market. And there's also challenges, right, with respect to implementation levels and perhaps some of the restrictions that were taken haven't been done so, aligned with the frameworks in which the regional frameworks. So there seems to be both some opportunities here and also some limitations about the role of economic communities. And I'm going to now turn the panel to Patrick, and we're going to slightly switch gear to hear from him about where the WTO comes in this discussion. What can the WTO do to ensure that the role of regional economic communities can be leveraged in responding to COVID-19 immediately and also both in the aftermath? So Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Colin. Good afternoon, everybody. It's interesting listening to the presentations about regional initiatives and regional responses, because I have two reactions to that. One is it's absolutely clear that there are certain things that that the regions can do that the WTO would never even think about doing. And this is partly to do with geography, but it's also to do with political solidarity and a number of other things. Not that that always works, but those are important factors which make it possible for regions to take responsibility for a number of things. But just as no country can go it alone in fixing COVID, my sense is that no regional grouping can either. Need a broader canvas upon which to manage these challenges and problems. And that's where the WTO comes in. I think the core message has to be that resilience in managing, dealing with, moving beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, the resilience required must be about cooperation. It cannot be about self-sufficiency. Perhaps I'll say a little bit more about that a bit later. What is clear is that in many parts of the world, and I think this obviously affects the WTO too, initial responses to the crisis were not always very nice. So we have the examples, for example, of Germany, France, and Italy not being very nice to Switzerland by confiscating goods that were destined for Switzerland, holding them up and so on. And that was happening in the early days until they got their act together. And now there's a quite impressive level of cooperation within the region. So I think that's a sort of experience that many regions will have had to deal with. So what about the WTO? Well, there's been quite a lot of activity amongst members and also from the Secretariat. The members have submitted no fewer than 24 proposals. Some of them are rewrites or expansions of previous ones, but all these have involved dozens of members. Not all members have participated so actively in this, but dozens have. And so what you have is a range of proposals on PPE, access to PPE, medicines, food. Oftentimes these are intended to affirm that the use of export measures will be highly restrained. That is the undertaking. They'll be temporary, they'll be targeted, they'll be proportional, they'll be transparent, and they'll be WTO consistent. I think there has been an improvement on some of the activity in that respect, because as Colette said at the beginning, a lot of countries did a lot of things. Now, I guess it's not reasonable to expect governments not to take care of the interests and needs of their own populations. That's where words like temporary, targeting, proportional come in. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We've still got to see how this is going to work out, but I do think quite a lot has been achieved in terms of taking a more orderly approach to cooperation in these areas. Also, there are some discussions about protection of the integrity of supply chains, the proposals on MISMEs. My sense is that the real challenges are going to emerge when economies are in recovery mode. Will they keep markets open and resist the temptation to succumb to easy wins that ultimately turn out to be losses? If you restrict imports in order to raise domestic output, that will hit efficiency and it ultimately prejudice output and jobs. It won't do your exports any good, and it's likely to provoke retaliation. But the short-term temptation is there. You want to get your economy moving, you want to get jobs, you want to get the job rate up. And so it's quite tempting to say, well, if we did more of this ourselves and imported a little less, we could do it. This could be some kind of shortcut, but it's not a shortcut. It's a mistaken pathway. So I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. And I think the regions, even if they don't succumb to this in their regional cooperation arrangements, they could also be affected by this kind of behavior. So what about the Secretariat? The Secretariat's been very active. There have been at least 14 papers written by the Secretariat under its own responsibility. I haven't read all of them from cover to cover, but what I have looked at is that seems to me to be high quality and very useful. A number of the figures that Colette was citing at the beginning, coming from the GTA, have also been produced in the WTO in relation to export restrictions, who's taken them, what has been done on the import side. There is some work done by Simon Evanet and Alan Winters, suggesting that actually an opportunity that arises from all of this is that there could be a scope for a deal. In return for restraint on export measures by those who are in a position to be exporting the relevant products, those who have opened their markets, of which there has been quite a lot, reducing tariffs and easing up administrative measures and other types of measures that affect imports, that these things become part of the policy framework, that they become part of permanent approaches to policy. I think that's a very interesting idea, and once again, this has significant implications for regions as well. I think the WTO secretaries also contributing very well to the information about what is actually going on trade and trade-related measures. They run continually updated databases on measures affecting goods, services, and intellectual property. So I think that is also a contribution. And then they have a series of other papers on things like transparency, e-commerce and COVID-19, standards, services, NISMEs, least developed countries, women and vulnerable communities, trade costs, and so the list goes on. My sense is that, as I said before, the real test is going to come when the sense of urgency and emergency starts to diminish, which is certainly not the case yet. Will countries continue to cooperate? I think there are very nice and attractive stories coming out of the regions of how the silver lining has been that levels of cooperation which might otherwise have taken longer to achieve have been achieved in order to respond to the crisis. And in a sense, there's a similar situation in the WTO on a completely different level. I was looking the other day at what's happening in the WTO in relation to the way meetings are held. Now you have these hybrid meetings with virtual and physical presence. The whole idea of having a virtual component of meetings is revolutionary. Will it stick? It has some significant advantages if it does, and the question is, what can be done to make it stick? So I think that's a question also for the regions, and whether the WTO can help or not, and that depends to some degree, in my view, upon whether the WTO leads by example. And that, given the current situation in WTO, we shouldn't take for granted. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for giving us this overview of where the WTO can come in. This is really completing the picture in a way with the multilateral level and the interaction between the multilateral level and some of the regional responses. I'm going to ask one other question to the panelists, but before I do that, I just wanted to remind the audience that if you have any questions, please feel free to post those in the chat box. I assume by now everybody knows kind of how this works, so feel free to just, write those up, and then we'll be opening this up to the audience, to all of you, within 5 minutes or so. So any questions that you may have, or any ideas that you want to bring to this discussion, or experiences you've had from your own regions in the way they've responded to COVID-19, please contribute to the discussion and enrich it by sharing those. But before doing that, I was wondering if perhaps now that we've had this overview of the WTO and where the WTO could come in, as this discussion focuses on regional economic communities in developing countries, one element that we haven't touched upon yet is technical assistance, special and differential treatment. Perhaps Ambassador Blackman and Trudy, you could highlight where you think, based on your experience with the regional communities in responding to COVID-19, where this would be most urgent, and how aid for trade, for example, could be linked to providing this kind of assistance, or any other idea that you may have that you think would enable developing countries to get the type of technical assistance they may need. And Patrick, feel free to contribute to this as well.
Thank you very much. If I may, at this point, I would simply say of from a technical assistance point of view, there is urgent and great need in developing and allowing for member states, particularly on the export side at this time. A number of it, well, let's backtrack a bit. In order for there to be true regrowth or retooling of the economies in the region, small, medium, and enterprises are going to have to take the lead from the private sector perspective. There is a school of thought which supports the idea that growth will be led by small and medium businesses taking charge. Now, that will come with a number of challenges because for them to supply their domestic populations, but also to export in circumstances where there's not necessarily a large pool or economy of scale for them, you're going to need a lot of technical support and capacity building for them to do that in a very short period of time. So these are one of the areas or low-hanging fruit, as you call them, for the international community to really focus on in terms of the response that's needed at that level. There also has to be a level of understanding in terms of, as I said before, the ability to produce goods at a technological level. That's another area that's critical to the region because the region cannot continue to be sustainable or desire to be sustainable if there's that inherent need for the importation of goods that we need, not goods that we may desire, but goods that are critical to our existence when external shocks of this nature are needed. So these are some of the things, not just in the WTO, even though it's Geneva Trade Week, but we're talking in a broad sense. A number of other key institutions have to play a part, and there's a great need for inter-organizational dialogue, particularly at this time. Yes, through a trade lens, institutions like the World Health Organization, WIPO from an intellectual property perspective, these conversations have to be had. And perhaps, yes, the WTO and its members can drive this process, but there has to now be a broader multilateral approach to these things. Oftentimes, us in the trade community, and I'm speaking as a trade lawyer, are very siloed in our thinking and think that trade is, in reality, we have to have an inter-organizational approach if we really want to see our countries receive the capacity building that we're all seeking to get.
Colette, if I may come in here, and thank you very much to Ambassador Blackman for that contribution. His reference to productive capacity development, I think, is particularly important in the context of Africa as well. But before I say something about that, I'd like to emphasize the trade aspects. And it is very well known, well documented. The evidence is really difficult to refute that non-tariff barriers, many of which are associated with customs and border management, are far more pernicious barriers to intra-Africa trade, and of course also erode our competitiveness in the global economy than tariff barriers. And this is an area where, of course, our development partners are already assisting very, very significantly. But what we have seen, and I'm really hoping that we will get support, but we'll also take the initiative post-COVID to continue using digital trade solutions. There is a risk of returning to pre-COVID practices and the use of really reams of documentation and other practices which, to be honest, just slow down cross-border trade and really add to the transaction costs of not only intra-Africa trade, but also our trade with global trade partners. A lot of important examples are available for us to emulate and to build on. The use of e-certificates, interagency cooperation. We find, for example, that certain countries, in terms of their bilateral cooperation, but also at country level in terms of interagency cooperation, have really been using emails to coordinate. And this, of course, can be moved to platforms, distributed ledger, platform arrangements, and so on. Single windows become really important here. And this is an area where a huge amount has to be done in terms of connectivity, energy security, the technology, equipment that is going to be needed, scanning equipment, for example, sophisticated scanning equipment and so on. So there's a huge amount that needs to be done. The World Customs Organization, the WTO, and many development partners have been assisting us. We now have an opportunity where there is perhaps more openness to using digital trade solutions for us to really move this agenda ahead. So I'm really hoping that we will, all of us, collaborate across the continent with our trade partners, with our development partners to move this agenda ahead, because these are real challenges, not only in terms of trade, but of course they also impact excuse me, our capacity to develop our domestic productive capacity. And I could say something about that a little bit later. Thanks, Colette.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Blackman and Trudy. This is a really helpful perspectives on, and what I'm hearing also what Patrick was mentioning earlier, the importance of the way in which countries have used this crisis as an opportunity to advance certain issues, to lower certain trade barriers, both with respect to tariffs, but also and perhaps especially with respect to some of the non-tariff issues that Trudy mentioned. There is a need to ensure that we stay where we are, that we don't go backwards once the pandemic is hopefully at one point behind us. So I think that is a really important lesson and message, and perhaps some of the ways forward, in addition to focusing on what the role is of a regional economic community in helping countries respond to a pandemic, should be in what the role can be of a regional economic community or the WTO in ensuring that we don't go backwards from where we are now. And that may be one question that we can give some thoughts to. Patrick, I don't know if you wanted to add something to this before we open up the floor.
Just one thing that I think is worth mentioning is the fact that there are so many different aspects of the crisis. It's not just about trade. Trade is important, but it's not just about trade. It's about health. It's about infrastructure. It's about a range of different things. And it seems to me that something that WTO and other international agencies could do that would have a very positive impact on the regions and on individual countries is work together more closely. Is have a coordinated and a coherent, they're not supposed to be in competition. They're supposed to be complementary. They're supposed to help to create a situation that is multidimensional, to make it into a manageable whole where interaction with regional arrangements and with individual countries can be much more efficient, much more straightforward, and ultimately much more productive. So I think that the WTO and others should be working hard to interact effectively with one another and to putting together the interconnections between what they're doing and the crisis.
Great, thank you so much, Patrick. We're now opening up the discussion to the audience. This is the moment where it would be great when we're all in the same room, but we've acquired technological skills at this point, so we're just going to have to do it with the chat box. I have one question here from Ada Siquiera from Sidley, Austin. She's asking the following. Given that Germany, the United States, and Switzerland supply 35% of critical medical products, do you think there is any concrete political role that regional groups can play in guaranteeing that these products will be fairly exported across the globe? For instance, a role for the African Union or the CARICOM in negotiating fair prices and access to these products. So question on the more systemic inequalities between or differences between production. I don't know if any of the panelists likes to volunteer in responding to this. I feel like everyone wants to volunteer.
I'll take the first bite out of it.
Go ahead, Ambassador Blackman.
Okay. No, I think, yes, I wanted to have a quick jump at that one. It goes back to the point I made earlier about critical mass. It's more difficult for, let's say, a small country with 290,000 people or 40,000 citizens, for example, to negotiate with a larger trading nation or group of countries on these critical goods. However, as a regional bloc, whether that's CARICOM or the African Union, you now have a larger platform to demand, as you said, fairer prices and the terms and conditions in which these goods would be offered to the market. So it therefore reemphasizes the fact that regionalism, which was one of the reasons why they were envisioned years ago as a tool for trade and development, it becomes even more important now for us to engage through that mechanism to be able to supply the necessary goods and services for our populations. In circumstances where the vulnerabilities that we have are there, a number of our countries economically to external creditors. So therefore, to purchase goods on the external market with much critical foreign exchange in circumstances where it's not as plentiful as it could be, speaking on a regional level, these are the tools and mechanisms and strategies that will be now very important. So I'm glad that that question was asked, because it really reemphasizes the need for regional blocs to now collectively bargain for critical things such as these.
Colette, if I could add perhaps to that from an African perspective, in recent months we've seen quite a lot of focus on continent to continent debates and discussions, a collective voice for Africa in terms of global trade and other relationships. And there have been questions about the role of the African Continental Free Trade Area. But of course, the AFCFTA is a free trade area. So those state parties of the AFCFTA retain their policy space to negotiate trade agreements with third parties. However, if we take a look at a range of issues such as access to medicine, a collective voice from Africa could be extremely important. The African Union has a number of flagship projects, and it has a flagship project, a suite of initiatives under the Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa. And one of those programs focuses on the development of the pharmaceutical sector across the continent. This could be a very important opportunity for Africa's collective voice to engage with our trade partners, but also to engage with some of the important global pharmaceutical companies in terms of perhaps location of productive capacity, so some investment into Africa's pharmaceutical sector. This, I think, is an opportunity we should not miss. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Blackman and Trudy, for that. Patrick, you also wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think most of what I had in mind has been said. I think that there are some short-term, the investment point is really important, but I think there is also some immediate things that could be done, assuming that the necessary cooperation exists at the regional level. Very practical things to do with bulk buying, to do with bulk ordering, bulk negotiating price on the basis of a larger quantity, finding ways of lowering trade costs, things like transport and various administrative costs by buying in bulk. I think those are important initiatives that regions could certainly think hard about. And, you know, the figure that was cited by the questioner is only one of two figures that I suspect the source was the WTO papers that I was referring to. The other figure is to do with PPE exports. And here there are only three countries, and they account for 40%, the US, Germany, and the US. Now, that concentration isn't going to be dented in the short term. And so whatever happens, there's going to have to be a way of getting access, a regular access, and some notion, and this is where the WTO could play a role, basically trying to coordinate an approach which makes sure that there is an adequate response to the needs of all countries wherever they are. But again, regions need to also coalesce around common positions and purpose in order to achieve that.
Many thanks for everyone. To everyone. I have another question here from Scott Anderson, who is asking, how will the WTO or regional organizations cooperate in the purchase and distribution of a vaccine in developing countries? So slightly shifting gears a little bit, but once we hopefully get that vaccine, what do you think would be the role of the regional entities or the WTO? Patrick, do you want to start that?
No, I just want to say that it's good to see such active participation from Sidley Austin. Apart from that, this is an issue which I'm not aware yet of what conversations have taken place. There is this agreement that's been signed amongst a very large number of countries just recently, the last couple of days, about trying to deal with this in a fair and balanced way. China and the US didn't sign, so I don't know. But I really do think it's really very important, and the more pressure that can be brought to bear, the better on making sure that this happens. I think that the kind of behavior one might see with the vaccine, we might even be a little uglier than what one saw in the early days with respect to PPE and medicines, and food for that matter. So I think it's something to really watch and something to plan for very actively.
If I could just come in there, Colette, I think, Patrick, I share your concerns that we might see some very inward-looking responses as far as access to the vaccine is concerned. This is also where we have seen very important initiatives in the philanthropy space. Many African countries have recorded significant assistance currently in terms of access to PPE, pharmaceutical products, ventilators, and other medical equipment. And so again, I would emphasize the point you made earlier about cooperation. This is really, really important for all of us, that everyone, even in Africa's 33 least developed countries, gets access, equal access to the vaccine. But it is going to require concerted effort. Again, this is where a collective voice from the African Union could be particularly important, supported by all the regional economic communities and the member states. But this is where we need development partners and our philanthropists who really have made significant contributions already. Thanks very much.
If I may add, I'd simply say, obviously the role of WTO is the world regulator of trade, and that's rightly made, really. It has to be one where the organization and its members work collectively with other institutions and partners, because this is much broader than the WTO or a trade issue. Equally, there is the role, to my mind, to ensure that when the goods come to market, that fair prices are there, because this is not a time for the companies who manufacture the vaccine to see this as a venture of profit, because this global event, we've seen it already, has really debilitated a lot of what the gains that we've accrued over the last decades. So we have to see it in more a holistic sense, and also, as was rightly said by Trudy, in a very developmental sense. And let's face it, the developing countries, by and large, the majority of them, are not going to be, at least in a short period of time, the developers of these vaccines. That's a fact. So we have to ensure, therefore, that there's an equitable distribution and not also a hoarding of the vaccines as well for the populations who enjoy coming from the country or regions that these vaccines will be produced from. That will be a very critical test for the global community to undertake.
Right. So we're still collecting some questions from the audience, but as we do so, I would like to get back to something that has been mentioned, but perhaps we can delve into this a little bit more in detail. Ambassador Blackman, you mentioned in the very beginning of your presentation that Barbados had become a hub for digital nomads, if you will, due to your very strong IT and digital infrastructure. Trudy, going back to the AFCFTA ongoing negotiations, I believe that it's now been agreed that there will be a digital chapter or part of the AFCFTA, or that's currently something that's still being discussed. Where and could all of you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on where you see the role of the digital economy coming here, and more specifically, how we can use both regional economic communities, but also the WTO in leveraging that? There's the obvious ongoing negotiations on the joint statement initiatives on e-commerce and things like that. Could we link that to facilitating the creation of an enabling digital environment in developing countries, and thereby facilitating and strengthening the response to COVID-19, and not only that, but ensuring that as the pandemic at one point wanes out, we don't go back to paperwork at customs and things like that, as you mentioned, Trudy. Perhaps we can have a quick discussion about that.
Colette, if I may come in on that, it is true, in fact, that in the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations, a recommendation has now been made to negotiate a protocol on e-commerce. And that was initially a summit decision that was taken some time ago, and indications were at that stage that it would be negotiated in a phase 3 of the negotiations. We don't have timelines, so concerns and the experience of COVID have in fact prompted the senior officials and also the ministers of trade to make a recommendation that this be moved forward to phase 2, because it was initially a summit decision to negotiate in phase 3. Of course, summit has to change that decision, and the summit meeting will be held early December. But all indications are that we will move ahead early next year to negotiate a protocol on e-commerce. As far as digital solutions and taking a look at digital economy developments for Africa are concerned, I think we do have to do a reality check. What COVID has emphasized is the enormous inequality and exclusion which still exists when it comes to access to energy and access to connectivity. So this has had significant implications for education, for example, also for access to healthcare, access to financial services, and of course, many, many other services that are traded digitally now. So there is, and I think Patrick mentioned this, we have to invest in digital infrastructure. But at the same time, we've also got to look at regulation, and regulatory cooperation across the continent may not be sufficient. We may have to consider, and this would go a little way ahead of what member states have agreed in the AFCFTA, towards harmonization of regulations, so that we can facilitate cross-border payments, use of fintech solutions, for example. I'm really hoping that there is some young tech entrepreneur about to develop a solution, a trade finance solution for informal cross-border traders. Many informal cross-border traders are women, and they have a wealth of information which really constitutes, I would say, new generation collateral in terms of their customer base, payment records, and so on. We need to think beyond what collateral in terms of a 20th century approach is to leveraging this kind of data, the big data, if you will, that is available in that space. So there are significant opportunities, but the reality is that we still face significant infrastructure challenges and regulatory challenges. So domestic regulations which permit access to small-scale renewable energy producers to the national grids have to change. And that, for some countries, is quite an important step and a very difficult one, it seems, even in my own country, South Africa. So very important to look at the opportunities, but realistically look at what needs to be done to take advantage of these opportunities. Thank you.
Patrick?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things. One is this whole discussion of infrastructure, the digital divide. It's a lot of people talk about it, not a hell of a lot is being done about it. And how that's going to be leveraged is something that I think is a very serious challenge. But I want to mention one other thing which worries me about e-commerce in particular, and that is the battle that's already engaged amongst the developed countries over digital taxes, digital sales tax in particular. This is turning into a very nasty fight. Kenya and Nigeria are trying to lead the way in Africa to find ways of taxing the internet, essentially. Now, there's a big debate about where value is created, what the tax base should be, whether it's WTO consistent. Unfortunately, I think the EU, perhaps in what they've been the pioneers in trying to tax this, made some decisions that were interpreted by the US in particular as being aimed at US companies first and foremost. Whether that is fair or not, the point I want to make in general is that it is essential that if e-commerce is going to take its rightful place, apart from all the challenges of the digital divide, must get the fiscal story right. And that is just a subset of what Trudy was talking about the regulatory framework, the regulatory environment that's created. So I think people should be thinking already about how to fix this problem.
Ambassador Blackman, did you want to come in? I believe he's having some connectivity issues, but he will be back with us shortly. I had, as we're getting a little bit more into this debate, I was also wondering, in terms of what's been touched upon by almost all of you, the issue of non-tariff barriers, which seems to really stand out as something that needs to or requires still a lot of work in the context of facilitating regional trade. So perhaps we can delve into that just a little bit. Some have suggested that to facilitate trade of a variety of essential products in the aftermath of COVID-19, what is really important is using regional trade agreements to engage in things like mutual recognition agreements, or I believe Trudy mentioned harmonization, and those types of things. What do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has done to further push the conversation on the harmonization of standards, or on the mutual acceptance or recognition of standards? Have you seen examples of where this has been accelerated as a result of COVID-19, where countries have said we will not do double testing for this because we've got the pandemic, or they're more open to accepting other countries' standards? Has that been something that in your experiences has happened as well? And if not, to what extent do you think regional economic communities should and or could be facilitating this? And what is the role of the WTO here? I mean, I've seen that under the trade facilitation agreement, there have been notifications done by a number of countries on what kind of facilitative measures they've taken in addition to what they already have in response to COVID-19. So where do you think the potential opportunity lies within this broader rubric of NTBs, non-tariff barriers, trade facilitation, harmonization, and mutual recognition of standards? This is my last detailed question, and then I'll ask the panelists to come with one final thought on a key takeaway of where to take this to the next, where to take this next. So if you can start thinking about that.
Colette is trying to make a contribution, particularly on standards. This is an area, again, where at national level, our capacity to do testing for standards, conformity assessment, and so on, in some countries is extremely limited. What's quite interesting is the Afrixim Bank has started an initiative to support quality assurance infrastructure. So it's a partner development, a complementary development to the AFCFTA, which is particularly important. But we have to acknowledge also is that accepting the standard certificates issued by a trading partner requires not only capacity, but also trust. What we do see is that very often there is a lack of trust in terms of accepting certificates that have been issued by other parties. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. But Afrixim Bank, moving way outside its normal territory of providing trade finance, has launched an important initiative to support the development of quality infrastructure across the continent. If I may just very quickly say a couple of things about trade facilitation, I think this, again, so important. If we look at the number of portals that are available across the continent now to notify non-tariff barriers, many of them are associated with customs and border management. And what we have seen during COVID are some photographs of queues that are up to 90 kilometers long. You can imagine how many days that's going to take to clear customs. Any kind of measures, restrictive measures on one side of the border immediately impact the other side. So land borders, they've got two sides. That means cooperation is extremely important. What we have seen is that some countries have started introducing expedited queues for essential products. That could be done. So that relates to initiatives that are really practical trade and border management issues. I think there are a lot of opportunities that we can discuss there. The other thing is the use of simplified trade regime. Some regional economic communities have them, some countries have de minimis allowances and so on, but some don't yet have them. And this, to take a look at our small informal cross-border trading community, could be extremely important. It's not yet discussed in the AFCFTA, but there is an opportunity to have that discussion now. Thanks very much.
Question, which I am going to read out before we close this panel. So we've got about 8 minutes left. We'll try to do all of this quickly. So the question is, how successful has the incentivization of universal and private sectors has been? Well, the incentivization of universities and private sectors to create essential products been? Will this be a long-term project in the Caribbean, and what are the implications on reducing external shocks? So I guess the question is asking about the role of private sectors in developing access to essential products. If anyone has a quick thought on that, please, the floor is yours before we wrap it up. Shirley, I'm looking at you.
If there are no other contributions, I can perhaps just share that certainly in those countries that have some manufacturing capacity, we have seen very good examples of repurposing production facilities. What we've also seen is some universities, the engineering students have become particularly important and innovative in developing new masks, ventilators, and so on. So there's a level of innovation that we really do need to leverage. But this is also an opportunity to build some regional value chains. So I think very important in terms of broadening our productive capacity. There are significant opportunities, and we are seeing some good examples across the continent. Thank you.
For the last couple of minutes of this panel, I would ask kindly for all the panelists to leave us with one idea that you think is the key as regional communities continue to respond to the pandemic, and the WTO is also formulating its response. So from all the great ideas and observations you've made, maybe just select one that can stick with everyone as they leave this panel. And I believe we've lost Ambassador Blackman, so perhaps Trudy can start, and then followed by Patrick, and then hopefully we get Ambassador Blackman to join us then again.
Thanks so much, Colette. I think for me, my hope is that we don't go back in terms of customs and border management to the paper-driven processes. Recently, we had a workshop and DHL indicated that they were using, for a number of border posts, something like 1 ton of paper a week. That's an absolute travesty. We cannot go back to business as usual. So let's not revert to the way things used to be. Let's learn and build on what we have seen actually works during COVID. Thank you.
Patrick, do you want to share a final observation?
I was just waiting for permission. No, so my thought is very close to Trudy's. I think consolidate the positive. Things have happened which would not have happened but for the emergency, but for the crisis. Cooperation has been intensified in some important areas. Different things have happened, like, for example, 27 members have notified measures to the WTO where they have actually eased up on process and procedure at the border. If it's possible to do this in the name of fixing the crisis, why isn't it possible to keep those things in place? And this requires leadership, it requires commitment, and this needs to be driven from every which way direction. That means from the WTO side, and perhaps even more especially from the regional. There needs to be leadership in the regional context to get this to happen, in my view.
I believe we have permanently lost Ambassador Blackman here on the panel, unfortunately. So we'll have to just create a placeholder for what he would have to say. I think this has been a really, really rich exchange of ideas on where the challenges are with respect to regional economic communities' responses to COVID-19, both short-term related to essential products as well as long-term. This is not a panacea. There's been a lot of obstacles, and it also involves to getting this right a lot of different actors, as we've heard, right? So not just regional economic communities, not just trade agreements, but also the business community, the civil society, the WTO as an overarching guiding trade framework, and leadership. And I think also in addition to that is the conversation between different regional economic communities in developing countries that are all struggling with similar questions in a slightly different context. But I think the exchange of what works and what has worked in, say, Barbados or in the CARICOM, and what has worked in SADC and in the EAC, or what hasn't worked, and how different regional communities can learn from each other, and how these learnings can be reflected back into where the WTO stands and how the WTO can give leadership on further consolidating, in this case, some of these best practices that are emerging, as well as ensuring that we don't go backward. I think that is some of the key takeaways as well of this panel. So I thank you very much. First, to all the great panelists for taking the time to join this discussion and share with us your expert knowledge and insights. It's been really enriching, and I'm sure the audience has learned a lot from your insights. I thank everyone still in the audience for still being with us, and despite being in this kind of awkward format of digital conversation, it's always a lot more fun when you can interact and be in the same room and have a coffee after the event. But hopefully we can get back to that soon enough. And please stay tuned on any further events organized by TULIP Consulting. You can find us on our website, which is tulipconsulting.ch, for any more information about some of the activities that we're doing. Thank you so much to everyone. Have a good day.